The plastic bag rustled softly as investigators emptied it onto the metal table, one object at a time. Coins, an old metro token, a folded scrap of paper with a hand-drawn grid. 63 squares were crossed off in blue ink. One was still empty. Outside the interrogation room, Moscow metro trains roared past on schedule, carrying thousands of people who had once shared platforms and cars, with the man now sitting handcuffed in a chair, staring at that unfinished chessboard. Alexander Pichushkin had grown up on the southwestern edge of Moscow, in the concrete rows of apartment blocks near Bitsevsky Park. When he was a small boy, he fell from a swing and struck his head, an injury doctors treated and forgot, but one relatives later blamed for his sudden mood swings and violent temper. At school, he was mocked for his speech and withdrawn manner. He rarely fought back. He simply pulled away and carried his anger home. Home, at least for a time, meant his grandfather's apartment. The older man was strict but patient, and he was the first to realize how intensely the boy focused on patterns and numbers. He taught him chess. Together, they spent long evenings bent over the board while the television murmured in the background. At the park tables and in metro stations, Pichushkin watched old men and young hustlers study the grid like a battlefield, thinking several moves ahead. On that small square of wood, he could control everything. Nothing moved unless he willed it. When his grandfather died, that sense of order vanished. Pichushkin moved into the empty apartment with the chessboard and a growing conviction that he no longer fit anywhere. He drank more, drifted through low-paid jobs, and walked Bitsevsky Park for hours, watching people from a distance. Neighbors remembered him as unpredictable, silent for days, then suddenly explosive over a slight glance or a careless word. According to what he later told investigators, during those years he began to think seriously about killing. He said that taking a life made a person feel like God, completely in charge of whether someone else continued to exist. The idea started as a fantasy, something he turned over in his mind during long, drunk walks through the park. Eventually, he decided to test whether the feeling matched the thought. His first known victim was a former classmate, Mikhail Odiochikov. In 1992, Pichushkin invited him to Bitsevsky Park, saying they should drink together in memory of a girl they had both liked. The two young men disappeared into the trees with plastic bottles of cheap vodka. When Odiochikov was drunk enough and the path had emptied, Pichushkin pulled a hammer he had hidden in his clothing and struck him from behind. The body was found later and written up as one more alcohol-related death in a city that saw many. No one connected it to the quiet, angry man who kept coming back to the same park. For years afterward, official records showed only scattered bodies, men with head injuries, found near drainage ditches or concrete culverts. Later, Pichushkin claimed he had been killing throughout that period, but investigators could only verify some of those early stories. What is certain is that by the early 2000s, Bitsevsky Park had become his chosen hunting ground. The park was big enough to swallow people. Thick stands of birch and pine ran down into gullies and ravines. Narrow paths twisted away from the main walkways and disappeared behind earthworks and old concrete structures. By day, it was crowded with strollers, joggers, and dog walkers. In the evening, especially in bad weather, large sections emptied out. That was when Pichushkin went to work. He chose people he thought the city would not miss right away. Older men who drank, occasional homeless wanderers, laborers far from home. He approached them in public places with a bottle of vodka in his hand, speaking calmly, complaining about life, inviting them to go drink in nature. The invitation sounded casual, even friendly. Once they left the main path and followed him into the trees, he waited for the right moment, then swung the hammer from behind. His method was brutally consistent. He aimed for the back of the head, striking until the victim stopped moving. In several cases, he forced a broken bottle or a short stick into the skull afterward, a mutilation that later helped police link cases that had once seemed random. Some bodies he pushed into manholes or drainage channels and closed the covers, letting the darkness and water hide what he had done. Others he left in the grass, arranged to look like drunk men who had simply passed out in the park. The killings went on for years, spread out just enough that they blended into the background noise of a city already struggling with crime. Different precincts logged separate files: unidentified male, head trauma, circumstances unclear. Many victims had no local relatives pushing for answers. The pattern existed, but it lay scattered across desks and filing cabinets, invisible to anyone who was not looking specifically for it. Pichushkin kept his own record. On a piece of paper he drew an 8x8 chessboard and began crossing off squares. Each mark, he said later, represented a person he believed he had killed. In his apartment, he stuffed small items from victims into bags and drawers: plastic shopping sacks, empty bottles, bits of clothing. He watched televised crime segments and scanned the short newspaper notes about bodies found in Bitsevsky Park. When there was no coverage, he felt irritation, not relief. He wanted the city to feel his presence, even if it did not yet know his name. Eventually, he stopped limiting himself to older men. One of his final victims was a younger woman, Marina Moskalyova, a co-worker from the supermarket where he stacked shelves. In 2006, she agreed to meet him after work for a walk. Before leaving home, she wrote his phone number and the location of their meeting on a scrap of paper and left it for her teenage son. When she did not return, he went to the police with that note. Investigators traced Moskalyova's route to the metro and pulled surveillance footage from the station nearest Bitsevsky Park. On the grainy video, they saw her walking toward the turnstiles beside a tall man in a dark jacket. Co-workers identified him immediately as Alexander Pichushkin. When officers searched his apartment, they found the folded chessboard paper among his belongings. 63 squares were crossed off. One square, in the corner, remained blank. During interrogation, he did not act like a man trying to escape responsibility. He talked. He described luring victims with vodka, leading them into the park, and attacking from behind. He claimed his goal had been to kill one person for every square on the board, 64 in total. He insisted that the official count of victims based on bodies and forensic evidence was too low. He told detectives he had killed more than they could prove. His trial opened in 2007 in a Moscow courtroom fitted with a glass and metal cage for dangerous defendants. Pichushkin stood inside it in a dark jacket, often with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the proceedings with a flat, detached expression. Prosecutors laid out 49 murders and 3 attempted murders they could firmly tie to him through witness testimony, physical evidence, and his own detailed admissions. One by one, relatives of the dead stepped forward to speak about fathers, brothers, and sons who had walked into Bitsevsky Park and never come home. For families who had been told for years that their loved ones had simply fallen drunk and hit their heads, the forensic testimony was shattering. Experts described similar blunt force injuries, foreign objects driven into fractures, and bodies found along the same overgrown routes and concrete pits. What had once looked like accidents now lined up as the work of a single offender moving almost invisibly through the city. When the judges allowed Pichushkin to address the court, he did not apologize. He told them that killing had become essential to him, that a life without murder would be like a life without food. He talked about the sense of power he felt when he watched someone die and walked away, knowing that no one suspected him. His words hardened public anger and erased any possibility of sympathy. In October 2007, the court found him guilty on all counts. Russia had effectively suspended the death penalty, so the judges imposed the harshest sentence available: life imprisonment, with the first 15 years to be served in a special regime cell. For a man who had once treated the city as a board full of pieces, his world shrank to a few square meters of concrete, a bunk, a small table, and a narrow window. Outside the prison, investigators continued to review unsolved homicides from the Moscow region, comparing details to his methods. Even if more cases were eventually tied to him, they could not add to his punishment. For the families, the verdict offered only a limited kind of closure. It did not return the years stolen by a stranger who had chosen their relatives precisely because he believed no one would notice when they vanished. The story of Alexander Pichushkin left Moscow with hard questions. How many sudden deaths can pass as routine before someone sees that they line up in the same place and in the same way? How long can a single man hide inside the ordinary chaos of a big city, choosing victims from those who stand alone on a bench or a platform, bottle in hand, grateful for company? There are no easy answers, only the memory of a scrap of paper marked with crossed-off squares, and the knowledge that each one once stood for a living person who never made it out of Bitsevsky. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.